It was me, my best friend Alex, and his cousin Mike. We were all 19, just out of school, and ready for one last camping trip before real life kicked in. We chose a place called Miller's Hollow. It wasn't on the map. Mike had heard about it from his uncle, who once mentioned it as an old logging spot nobody uses anymore. That sounded perfect. The hike in took us 2 hours, no signal, no signs, just trees and silence. I remember that silence more than anything. Not peaceful silence, dead silence. No birds, no bugs, just the sound of our boots and the leaves cracking underneath. We found a clearing near a slow, shallow stream. We set up 2 tents, collected firewood, and joked about who'd get eaten first if it turned into a horror movie. Mike's the funny guy. He dies second, Alex said. I'm the smart one, I joked. So I die last. We laughed. We shouldn't have. That first night was calm. We made a small fire, roasted marshmallows, and watched the stars. But I remember waking up around 2:30 a.m. to a faint noise, like whispering. Not talking, just whispering, too low to understand. I thought maybe it was Mike and Alex joking outside the tent. When I unzipped and peeked out, the fire was dead. Their tent was closed. The whispering stopped. I figured it was the wind, but the trees weren't moving. The next day, we explored upstream. That's when Mike noticed something buried in the dirt near a crooked old tree. It looked like the edge of a wooden box. We dug around it with sticks until we pulled out this weird blackened crate. It looked ancient, rotted, heavy, covered in deep scratches. There was no lock, just a rusty latch. Bet it's full of gold, Mike joked. Or bones, Alex said. We opened it. Inside was nothing valuable. Just a bundle of twigs tied with red string, a few yellowed teeth, a small wooden figure with no face, and a folded piece of animal skin with faded symbols burned into it. Alex dropped the skin like it burned him. This is some witchcraft crap, he said. Let's burn it, Mike added. I said no. I don't know why. Something about it felt wrong to destroy. So we buried the box again, deeper this time. But something felt off after that. The woods felt colder. Even the sunlight looked different. That night we sat around the fire again. It didn't feel the same. Mike was quiet. He kept glancing at the trees. Alex was nervous, chewing his lip. Then we heard a loud crack, like a branch snapping just past the firelight. We all stood up. Probably a deer, I said. But no deer walks like that. We heard footsteps, slow, two-legged, crunching leaves, getting closer. Alex aimed his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. But when he turned back, there were wet footprints near the fire, bare, human, leading from the creek to where we stood. But we hadn't heard anyone come that way. We stayed up all night. No one slept. Mike kept whispering that something was watching us. At some point, he walked off into the dark without a word. Just left. We thought he went to pee. But he never came back. We shouted his name, walked along the creek. Nothing. By dawn, he was gone. We searched for hours, calling his name, retracing the trail back toward the creek and the big crooked tree. Nothing. No footprints, no torn clothes. It was like he just vanished. Alex wanted to call the cops, but there was no signal. I said we needed to hike back to the car, drive to the ranger station, report it. He didn't argue. We packed up in silence. But the woods were different. I don't mean emotionally. I mean physically. The trail we had used to come in, it wasn't there. We followed our compass west, the same direction we came from. After 3 hours of hiking, we arrived, back at the same campsite, same logs, same cold fire pit, Same hanging food bag. We stared at it like it had grown out of the ground. "This is wrong," Alex said, voice shaking. "We went straight. We didn't turn." I couldn't argue. We had not turned. But somehow, the forest had turned around us. It started raining that afternoon. Cold, thin drops that didn't stop. We sat inside the tent, wrapped in sleeping bags, not speaking. Every now and then we heard footsteps outside, always slow, one at a time. Crunch, pause, crunch. Sometimes they circled the tent. Other times, they just stood there. You can feel when someone's watching you, even through nylon. That night the firewood wouldn't light. It was too wet. So we sat in the dark, shivering, listening. At 2:11 a.m., Alex whispered, "There's someone out there." I didn't answer. I was already awake. Because I saw the shadow, too, standing just outside the tent, tall, thin, and completely still. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just waited. By morning, it was gone. So was Alex. I woke up to an empty tent. His sleeping bag was unzipped. His shoes were gone. No note, no sound, no scream during the night. I ran outside barefoot, calling for him. But I didn't go far. I was afraid of the trees now. They felt alive, watching. Near the creek, I found something. A small circle of stones, placed neatly on the wet earth. Inside it was the same faceless wooden figure from the box we buried. It hadn't just returned. It had followed us. I snapped. I didn't care where the car was. I just started running, through branches, mud, whatever was in the way. I ran until my lungs burned and my feet bled. And somehow, I made it to the road. There was my car, exactly where we'd left it. But hanging from the mirror was Alex's hoodie, wet, torn, smelling of smoke and mold. I got in the car. I didn't look around. I didn't even close the door properly. I drove and drove until I hit signal. Then I called 911 with shaking fingers. They found me at a gas station, 20 miles south. They searched the woods for 4 days. Never found Mike, never found Alex, only our tents and a box, empty. They asked me to explain what happened. I tried. But how do you say, "The forest didn't let us leave"? They didn't believe me. But that's okay, because a week later, I woke up to find something on my porch. A circle of stones, and in the center, a second box. This time I didn't open it, but I still hear them whispering, waiting. I wasn't running away from anything dramatic. No heartbreak, no midlife crisis. I just wanted silence. A weekend off-grid. No phone, no people. Just me, my tent, a good book, and the woods. I chose Black Hollow National Forest, mainly because it wasn't on many maps. Remote, dense. The kind of place you had to hike 2 hours just to get in. Perfect. The first day was peaceful. I set up camp by a mossy ridge near a small stream. The water was cold and clean. I made a fire, read for a bit, watched the sun disappear behind the trees. It got dark fast. The kind of dark you forget exists when you live near cities, the kind that swallows your flashlight beam. I slept early, no phone buzzing, no traffic, just wind and crickets. And then I heard it. At first I thought it was part of a dream, something brushing gently against the side of my tent. Like fingers, not claws, not wind, fingers. I sat up, heart suddenly awake before the rest of me. I waited. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was a twig falling, or a raccoon. Morning made me feel stupid for being scared. I boiled water, made coffee, took a walk deeper into the woods with my compass. The trees here were thicker, old, covered in pale lichen like faded skin. Around noon, I found something strange. A circle of stones, perfectly arranged, maybe 6 feet wide. In the center, a small pile of ash. Like someone had burned something there. Not recently, maybe days ago. No footprints, no trash, no sign of campers. Just the ring, waiting. I took a few steps back. My first instinct was to photograph it. But my phone was off. Dead weight. Just the way I wanted it. Still, the circle unsettled me. I walked back to camp before the sun got low. That night the wind was louder, or the trees were closer. Either way, I kept hearing things just beyond the firelight. Crunches, like footsteps, but never more than one or two at a time. Something that walked, then stopped, walked again, then waited. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched. At 3:17 a.m., I sat bolt upright. No sound, no movement, just a smell, burnt hair and rotten wood. It faded before I could process it. I didn't check outside. I didn't want to. By morning, I looked like I hadn't slept in a week. My eyes were bloodshot, my limbs heavy. I told myself I was just spooked, that I'd imagined the smell, the sounds, the shapes in the dark. But when I stepped out of the tent, I stopped cold. Footprints, not mine, not boots, bare feet, 5 toes, long, narrow, deep in the mud, leading from the edge of the trees to the back of my tent. Then, nothing, no return trail, no prints leaving, just the ones coming in. I stared at them for a long time, too long. I didn't touch them, I didn't try to measure them. I just packed up everything as fast as I could. By noon, I was walking back, compass in hand, same trail, same markers. I should have been back at the forest entrance by early evening, but I wasn't. After hours of walking, I stopped to drink water and realized the stream next to me looked familiar. Too familiar. So did the moss-covered rock nearby. I dropped my pack and walked 10 minutes in every direction, just to be sure. But when I returned, my tent was back, set up, firewood stacked, just like I'd left it that morning. I hadn't walked in a circle. I hadn't made a mistake. I was sure of that. But I was back, exactly where I started. The sun was already low. I didn't have the courage to keep moving. That night I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside the tent, clutching the knife I always kept in my bag. It felt like a joke, like bringing a straw to a gunfight. Still, it gave me something to hold on to, something human. Then came the whispers, not outside this time, inside my head, software. In a language I didn't recognize, not angry, not loud, just constant, like a slow chant, barely above breath. I covered my ears. Still there, I sang to drown it out. Didn't help. I screamed. That helped for a second, until I heard something outside mimic me. My own voice echoed back from the woods. But not exactly the same. It was slower. Like it was trying to learn how to say it. Trying to learn me. That's when I snapped. I burst out of the tent, knife raised, flashlight shaking in my hand. No one. Nothing. But something had moved. I saw it, just beyond the trees. A shape ducking out of sight. No sound, no trail. I stayed up till dawn, sitting with my back to the fire pit. The whispers stopped around 4 a.m., but the silence that followed was worse. When the sky turned gray, I started walking again. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just moved, fast, straight, no breaks. My compass needle started twitching. It would point north, then shift, then spin slowly in a circle like it was confused, like the forest had tilted around me. I tried using the sun, but clouds rolled in, thick, low. I couldn't even tell the time anymore. Around midday, I found something that stopped me cold. A shirt, my shirt, the one I'd worn yesterday, now torn and muddy, hanging from a branch. I dropped it like it was burning. Beside it, on the ground, were more bare footprints, Dozens this time, all around me, fresh. I didn't set up camp that night. I didn't sleep. I just ran, through bushes, over roots, my legs cut, my chest tight. The forest started to look wrong, trees too close together, bark peeling like dead skin, no wind, no animals, nothing but breathing, not mine, not close, just around me. Like the woods themselves were alive, watching. I collapsed just before sunrise. I didn't even know where I was anymore. And then I saw the road, a dirt road, barely visible between the trees. My car, right there, muddy, real. I ran, tripped, crawled the last few feet. I threw open the door and locked it, started the engine. Drove without looking back. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. I stayed silent. The forest grew thinner. I saw signs again. Cell signal returned. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. Something was sitting in the back seat. Not a person, not a thing. A shape, hunched, wrapped in what looked like my tent, soaked and dripping, skin too smooth, face too blank. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It just breathed. In perfect sync with me. I didn't stop driving. Not for hours. Not until I was in a city, surrounded by noise and lights. When I finally looked back again, the back seat was empty. But the tent, it was gone. I still go to sleep, hearing that breath in the quiet. Still wake up with dirt under my fingernails. And sometimes I find bare footprints in my hallway. I wasn't even supposed to be on that trip. I hate the outdoors, bugs, cold, no bathrooms, not my thing. But when Alex brought up the idea of one last real camping trip, the nostalgia hit hard. It had been years since the four of us had all been together like this. So I caved. It was me, Alex, Mike, and Jeremy. Four guys who'd been friends since high school, now all a little older, with jobs, responsibilities, and barely any time to see each other. This trip was supposed to be a reset. No phones, no distractions. Just a weekend in the deep woods, a place Alex claimed we'd never forget. We drove for hours, then hiked for 2 more to reach a remote clearing far from any marked trail. I'll admit it was beautiful. Silent. Untouched. It felt like we were the only people on Earth. We set up camp, got the fire going, cracked some beers, and laughed like we used to. For a while, it really did feel like old times. That was the first night. I remember staring at the campfire, zoning out a little as the flames flickered, and then I noticed something odd. Something I was sure hadn't been there earlier. There was a 5th chair around the fire, a folding camp chair, just sitting there. Not one of ours. It had a gray wool blanket draped over it, like someone had been sitting there and stepped away for a moment. I frowned and asked, "Okay, who brought an extra seat?" Mike shrugged. "Not me." Jeremy said, "Nope." And Alex looked around with this puzzled face, like he was trying to remember packing it and couldn't. We joked about ghosts and forest spirits, but deep down, I think all of us were a little unsettled. Still, we brushed it off, probably left behind by a past group. Right. We moved on. The night got colder. The fire burned lower. Eventually, we turned in one by one. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, stared at the roof of the tent for a while, and finally drifted off. Until around 4 a.m., something woke me up. I didn't know what. There wasn't a sound, not even wind, but I was suddenly wide awake. I crawled out of the tent quietly, trying not to wake the others. The campfire was just glowing embers at that point, cold, quiet. And then I saw it. Someone was sitting in the 5th chair, not moving, not speaking, just sitting there. I froze. It wasn't any of my friends. I could tell by the outline. The guy was bigger, broader. His posture was stiff. He sat straight, like he didn't even belong to his own body. "Hey," I called out, quietly. "You all right?" No answer. I took a hesitant step forward. The firelight barely touched his face, but from what I could see, he wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight into the dead fire. Another step, closer, closer. Then I saw it. His eyes were open, wide open, but unmoving, like he was looking through the flames into something far, far away. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone. So I did. I backed up, slowly, carefully, and slipped into my tent. Zipped it up and lay there, heart pounding so loud I was sure the others would hear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I was the first one up. I rushed outside, expecting to see, I don't know, footprints, a body, something. But the chair was empty, the blanket was gone, and none of the guys remembered seeing anything strange. They laughed it off, told me I must have had a bad dream. But I know what I saw. There was someone sitting in that chair, and he didn't belong there. I didn't tell the others everything. How could I? They already thought I was spooked by shadows and stories. I figured maybe I was. Maybe it had been a dream. But then again, I'd never had a dream that left me that shaken. Still, I tried to brush it off and enjoy the trip. Day 2 went by without anything weird. We hiked, swam in the lake, grilled some food, took pictures. Everything felt normal. But something was off with Alex. He kept glancing into the trees, quiet during our jokes, and twice I caught him checking over his shoulder like he was being watched. When I asked him if he was okay, he just said, "Yeah, fine, just tired." That night, after we ate and sat around the fire again, the mood was lighter, at first. But just as Jeremy was telling a story about his new job, he suddenly stopped and frowned. "Did we leave the 5th chair out?" he asked, pointing. I turned. It was back. Same exact chair, same position, same damn blanket. Only this time, there was something underneath it, a shape, a dark bundle of what looked like clothing, but bulkier, heavy. We stood up, confused. Mike walked over and kicked the chair. The blanket slid off. There was a deer skull underneath it, polished white, clean, no blood, just placed there. None of us spoke. The laughter died completely. "All right, who the hell thought this was funny?" Alex snapped. Nobody answered. It wasn't any of us. I knew it in my gut. And by the look on their faces, so did they. We argued about it for a few minutes. Jeremy wanted to pack up and leave, but Alex said it was probably a prank from another group nearby, that we were overreacting. Mike, always the skeptic, picked up the skull, said it was cool, and tossed it into the trees. I wish he hadn't done that. That night I didn't sleep, not really. I lay awake, ears straining, listening for the slightest movement. Every crunch of a leaf or snap of a twig outside the tent sounded too deliberate, like someone stepping. Around 3:30 a.m. I finally dozed off. But then I woke up to whispering, not voices inside the tent, number outside, close. It was low and steady, like chanting. I couldn't make out the words, just the sound, repeating, coming from the direction of the fire pit. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek. There were 2 people sitting by the fire, 2. One of them was Alex. He looked half asleep, swaying slightly in his chair, like he was hypnotized, and next to him, the other figure. It was the man. Same rigid posture, same stillness, but this time I could see his face. He was pale, too pale. His mouth didn't move. He wasn't the one whispering. He just sat there, staring straight at Alex, not blinking, not breathing. I crawled out slowly and called Alex's name. He didn't respond, just kept swaying. Then the man turned his head directly at me. No hesitation, like he'd known I was there the whole time. His eyes were wrong. They were completely black, not like demon black, more like glass marbles, empty, cold, reflecting the firelight, but showing nothing back. I stepped backward, and the fire suddenly flared. For a second, I thought the flames were going to explode, but then it died back down. The man stood up, tall, taller than I thought. He took one step toward me, just one, and I panicked. I ran to the tent, dove inside, and zipped it shut so fast I nearly broke the zipper. I waited for him to pull it open, but he never did. The next morning, Alex didn't remember anything, not the fire, not the man, not sitting outside at all. He looked exhausted, pale. His voice was hoarse. "Dude, you okay?" I asked. He just nodded and whispered, Don't let him sit next to you. We should have left. I knew it. Jeremy knew it. But Alex insisted on staying just one more night. He didn't look well, pale, sunken-eyed, like he hadn't slept in days. He barely spoke. Every time he glanced toward the trees, his face twisted with fear. A kind of silent terror he wouldn't explain. Mike was still pretending nothing was wrong, even after I told him about the whispering, even after I described the man. "Sleep deprivation," he said. "That's all it is." I knew better, because every night, the fifth chair came back. And every night, the man came with it. That last day, it rained, not a heavy storm, just a cold, steady drizzle that made everything gray and miserable. We stayed in our tents for hours, barely speaking. When night fell, something had changed in the air. There was no wind, no crickets, no owls, just silence. The kind that presses on your ears like pressure underwater. Mike was the first to break. "I heard something last night," he muttered, scraping right next to the tent, like fingers. Jeremy stared at him. "You too?" That's when Alex stood up, and in a shaking voice said, "He's here for one of us. He picks someone. He watches. He waits. But if you let him sit beside you, he stays." We just stared at him. "Alex," I said, "who is he?" He didn't answer, just walked over to the fire pit, soaked from the rain, and stared at the fifth chair. It was already there, and this time, it wasn't empty. The man was sitting, waiting, but something was wrong with him now. His head was tilted too far to the side. His jaw hung open. His hands were twitching slightly, like they were remembering how to move. I blinked, and he was closer. Not by a lot, just a few inches forward. But none of us had seen him move. Alex dropped to his knees. He whispered. I let him sit next to me. That first night, I thought I dreamed it, but I didn't. I let him sit, and now, he won't leave. Jeremy backed away, muttering a prayer. Mike just stood frozen, like his mind had finally caught up to what was happening. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed one of the campfire sticks, still a little hot, and flung it at the man. It went through him. No, really. Through. The flames passed through his chest like he was made of smoke. He stood up, and suddenly the fire roared to life, burning bright and violent, orange-red, and then black, not smoke. Flames turned black, licking the edges of our tents, swallowing the logs whole. We ran. We didn't pack, didn't look back, just ran. Through mud, rain, branches cutting our faces, lungs burning. We ran until we saw headlights in the far distance. We made it to the road. A truck driver saw us, covered in dirt and blood, and called the police. They went back to the site the next day. They found the fire pit, charred, cold, but nothing else. No chairs, no tent remains, no Alex. He never made it out of the woods. To this day, Jeremy refuses to talk about what happened. Mike moved to another state and stopped answering calls. Me, I sleep with every light on, and if I ever see an empty chair by a campfire again, I'm burning it.